Hello class, and welcome to your Chapter 4 lecture, where we're going to be discussing the gender differences in offending, specifically looking more towards female-specific research and what that says in regards to delinquency, because most of the research historically has been typically on males, so almost everything you learned so far is on male offending, and we need to now address what are the differences when it comes to female offenders and what special or specific factors do they present with. So, our learning objectives for this lesson are that by the end, you should be able to outline the various explanations for why adolescent females become involved in offending, describe a feminist theory of delinquency, identify the relationship between adolescent male and female offending, describe how gender affects the processing of adolescent females in the juvenile justice system, and identify the relationship between class and delinquency. So females have reported that they need to be listened to and feel heard, and a lot of female offenders don't feel that their stories are always being told. We also have social values and norms that can possibly lead to discrimination against females, specifically African American, Hispanic, and lower class female youth. So let's look at the social context of gender roles. So children socialize into pre-existing gender arrangements, and they have an active role in society and in their gender identity, which is an ongoing process. There are different vulnerabilities and protective factors that females present with. So white female girls often lose a sense of self-esteem when they go from elementary school to high school. However, African American girls have been shown to be able to maintain their self-esteem. Similarly, intercity African American girls, research shows that they put on a tough exterior to combat victimizations, especially sexual victimizations, and that those victimizations have a big impact on their personality and later development. Because girls internalize experiences and they have higher rates than of anxiety, depression, withdrawal, and eating disorders because they do internalize so much. So looking at the differences here between girls and boys, in developing their identity, girls develop their identity more in relationship to others, while boys develop their identity in relation to the world. Girls resolve conflict based on the relationships they have with that person, whereas boys do so based on rules. Girls tend to focus on themselves, looking at the connectedness and interdependence they have, while boys want to be independent and autonomous. And girls typically handle, or when they present with aggression, it's relational. Looking at the relationship they have with that person, whereas when boys present with aggression, they present with a lot of over-aggression, in that the aggression is not an appropriate response in that situation. So let's look at the female delinquent. So the feminist theory starts with the assumption that juvenile females are positioned in society in ways that make them vulnerable to victimization by males. So the 2003 North Carolina Research Triangle Institute, the OJJDP actually gave them grant money to study female delinquency and its consequences. So the girls' study group was formed, and they identified common characteristics and risk factors for female delinquents. Some of those common characteristics were that they had been victimized, they had an unstable family life, school failure, that they were repeated status offenders. They presented with mental health and substance abuse problems as well. The risk factors they presented with is that they had early puberty and physical development. They oftentimes were sexually assaulted. They presented with depression and anxiety. They had mother-daughter conflict and cross-gender peer influences, so they were more influenced by romantic partners or boys. Then we look at, there's 3 steps, they say, to female involvement into the juvenile justice system. So the first is that the juvenile is victimized. The female is victimized in some way, which then leads to substance abuse. So substance abuse is highly correlated with early childhood sexual victimization, which is then linked to childhood abuse and later development, or that juvenile later developing alcoholism or drug problems. 3, we have acting out. So because of all of these issues that the female has just gone through, they're now going to start acting out at home, at school, acting out sexually, as well as violating the law and possibly joining gangs. So here, this is a graphic from your book. This just outlines what they call the typical female delinquent offender. So she's between the ages of 13 and 18. She has experienced academic failure, truancy, and dropping out. She's going to have a history of repeated victimization, especially physical, sexual, and emotional abuse. She comes from an unstable family background, and that family may have been involved in the criminal justice system themselves. The family is not connected, and the female may feel social isolation. She also has a history of unhealthy dependent relationships with older males, which can lead to issues with becoming a child prostitute, which you'll watch a video on this week. And she has mental health issues, including a history of substance abuse. And then, unfortunately, they found that female delinquent offenders are actually apt more to be a member of the communities of color, so your minority groups. So let's look at a few theories of adolescent female involvement in offending. We're first going to look at gender neutral versus the feminist theory. So gender neutral says that there is no difference in the pathways that males and females take to delinquency. They both arrive to delinquent offending in the same manner. You then have your feminist theory, which says that no, gender, class, and race actually explain women's involvement in crime. So having a sexual and physical victimizations at home and their relationship to crime has an effect on whether that female is going to engage in delinquency, which is specific to females. Now we look at biological and constitutional theories. So there are the gender-related biological process differences can account for differences in these various categories, is what this theory argues. So looking at stress and anxiety, having ADHD or ADD and conduct disorders, an intellectual deficit, early puberty and early maturation, as well as mental health issues. We then look at psychological theories, which say that delinquent females exhibit psychopathology, so that they present with these different disorders, that they often present with suicide, dissociative disorders, borderline personality disorders, and PTSD as a result of those victimizations. So delinquent females are actually linked to having a poor home life and a deep sense of loneliness or low self-esteem. So this is uniquely dramatic biological onset of puberty, having a complex identification due to competing with their mother, the changing cultural position of females. Females are not so much the keep your head down, don't say, don't speak unless spoken to or asked to speak. You just, follow the rules of the house and you don't ask questions. Women are getting more powerful. Women are out in the workforce now. They're not just sitting at home taking care of children. So the cultural position of females in general has changed. And then lastly, we have this hostile picture that the world paints to young females. So you look at the media, it shows that if you're a young female, you should be afraid of the world. So psychological perspectives and theories look at all of these different factors in how a delinquent female comes about to engage in delinquency. Then we have sociological theories. So let's start with general strain theory, which I know we went over all of these theories last chapter, so we're not going to get too into detail here. But general strain theory regarding females says that the female experiences harsh disciplines, parental rejection, they experience abuse by their peers, and negative secondary school experiences, which can all impact delinquency. They also can be homeless and then need to have a strong need for money. So this creates strain in the female where they start to engage in offending. We then have blocked opportunity. So it's assumed that females are content occupying a role that's dependent on males by this theory, and that female delinquents regard their opportunities less positively than males do, so that females don't feel that they have opportunities to move upwards in society, or to obtain any goals that they may have. But the theory also argues a little bit that females don't have those goals as much as males do, which I disagree with. You then have social learning. So females are more likely to engage in delinquency if they're associating with older males, if they have mixed sex or all male peer groups, as opposed to just having female peers. And then social control says that females are less involved in delinquency because of gender role socialization results in more social bonds, so that females don't engage in delinquency as frequently as males do, because they have, again, going back to one of the earlier slides, their focus is on relationships and connectedness with others, so they're forming bonds with others, whereby forming bonds with social institutions, so they're less likely to engage in delinquency. And then the masculinity hypothesis says that as females acquire more masculine traits, they'll then be more likely to become a delinquent offender. Just a few more under the sociological category. We have the power control theory, which says that girls who come from egalitarian families are more likely to take risks and become delinquent. So egalitarian are not where the father is the patriarch of the family. These are families where the mother is also working. Then labeling theory says that some females actually become more delinquent than others because they've been informally labeled by either their teachers, parents, and others, or formally labeled by the juvenile justice system, very similar to how males would also come about delinquency through labeling theory. Then you have interactionist theory, where delinquency occurs through the process of role taking, where a youth considers the perspectives of significant others. So think about that, interactionist. So as the female is interacting with others, they're interacting with those who they value their perspective, whether it's a parent, peers, others in the community. They could come to engage in delinquency because they're respecting the wrong individuals' perspectives. Think about gangs. They're now respecting gang leaders, and obviously their perspectives of delinquency and offending are not going to be the same as a law-abiding parent, for example. Then you have deterrence. They lump deterrence, rational choice, and routine activities theories all together. So females who spend more time with peers during time that's unstructured and unsupervised, they're going to have higher rates of delinquency. But that's also very similar to males as well. When youth aren't engaged in structured activities, which is one of the big things that we push with youth on probation, when they are unsupervised and they have terrible ideas, as youth do when they get together in groups, they're more likely to engage in delinquent behaviors. So getting to the feminist theory. So here we have in the feminist theory that females are actually more likely to be arrested when a parent insists on arrest, and that parents typically insist on a female's arrest more than they do for their male child. That female offenders are more likely the victims of physical and sexual abuse than are males. So they found that actually 3/4 of sexual abuse victims are girls. However, I have to throw in the caveat there. Don't think your book mentions this, but other research does, that it is also possible that male sexual abuse victims rates are higher, but males are less likely to come forward about sexual abuse than are females. So we then have this process here of the feminist theory, and I just thought the graphic was easier to understand. So we have here that girls they start out by being frequently the victims of sexual abuse. Those victimizations then, which are sometimes from the father, they can utilize, so the victimizers, who are typically the fathers, can then utilize social service agencies to keep control over the victim and keep them in the home. Then girls start to run away from the home because they're forced out because they don't want to continue to be victimized. Now they're being forced to survive on the streets, and they could possibly become involved in various forms of crime that way, such as petty theft, prostitution, Maybe even they start to get into fights on the street because they're trying to protect themselves. And now they're on the streets where there's a lot more criminal activity and they're being exploited for their sexuality. Again, there's a video on prostitution and how girls can become involved in that you'll watch this week. So let's look at Moffat's development theory. So we have here life course persistent and adolescent limited. These are the two main developmental theories. So life course persistent offenders are those who develop lifelong course of delinquency into crime at a very early age. So they engage in delinquency as a juvenile and then they move into criminal offending as an adult. Adolescent limited, however, are those who engage in delinquency just as juveniles, and they typically desist around the age of 18. So females are more likely to be one-time offenders, and they're less likely to become those chronic or life course persistent offenders. In one study, they represented only 15% of violent offending, and males are typically 2.5 times more likely to become involved in delinquency than are females. So while we do have a female offender population, yes, the male offender population is much more large, and they tend to engage in more chronic offending, more lifelong offending. So let's look at the dimensions of females' delinquent behavior. So while males have greater access to drugs and they use at higher rates, females and males typically use alcohol and marijuana at the same rates. The consequences, however, for females engaging in delinquency and using drugs is much higher because they have consequences of becoming pregnant while they're addicted to drugs. Then you can have fetal issues due to that drug use. Females start getting involved in gangs, theft, prostitution. They can overdose, so can males. But these are specific consequences that your book identifies for females. And then contracting sexually transmitted diseases as well as HIV and AIDS. So there's a high percentage of street prostitutes who have been sexually abused as juveniles, as you'll see in the video that you'll watch this week. And then in 1992 to 2003, research shows that juvenile female arrests actually increased 6.4%. So they said that there was a 7% increase in aggravated assault arrests and a 41% increase in simple assault arrests during this time frame. So they were saying that female violent offending was at which is increasing at huge rates. However, we need to look at the effect of that the system's behavior has on juvenile female offending. So we have 3 ways here that it may not actually be that juvenile females are becoming or were becoming more violent, but simply the system's reactions and behaviors toward female juvenile offending changed. So we have this relabeling or bootstrapping, where you have status offenses being turned into criminal offenses. So for example, incorrigibility was defined as a status offense. Now we call that assault. You then have rediscovery of girls' violence, leading to an increase in arrests. So again, we are focusing a lot on male offending, and female offenders were just not being looked at as much. Also, there was part where it wasn't believed that a female would engage in fights or that a female would engage in, carrying drugs, delivering drugs, that they're females, that we need to protect them. They're not going to engage in these types of behaviors, until we realize that no, they do. Women engage in, and sometimes we learned in our gang chapter that sometimes female gang offenders are actually more violent than males. Then we have this idea of upcriming for minor forms of youth violence, which are specifically related to your zero tolerance policies. So especially in schools where you have zero tolerance for fighting and other types of activities that are considered delinquent, the officer has no choice but to arrest. So let's look at inequality among the 2 genders. So first, adolescent females actually receive discriminatory treatment because of society's disapproval of sexual activity related to females. So adolescent females are more likely to be referred to court for status offenses and treated more harshly because of their sexual history than males. So females also have a greater probability of being detained and being held for longer periods of time. Females typically have longer stays in detention and institutions for similar offenses that are committed by their male counterparts. Many girls also appear in court for criminal-type offenses that were previously classified as status offenses, as we briefly mentioned in the previous slide. And then certain provisions of the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act actually permit status offenders who are in contempt of a court order or who violate a court order that they may be placed in secure detention. So an example here, you have a female who runs away, who was ordered to stay home by the court order. That juvenile now leaves the home. They're now in contempt of court and can be detained in secure detention. And finally, we have that police, intake, and judges actually support this sexual double standard, and is evidenced by the fact that there are an increase in likelihood of having a court referral for being an adolescent or for being female, being more likely to be placed in detention pre-adjudication, so before actually admitting to or being found guilty of your crimes, and the fact that they're more likely to be confined in institutions, which would be the judge's decision. So we now need to look at class oppression. So research has shown that serious childhood and adolescent problems are actually linked to poverty. So issues like homelessness, unemployment, prostitution, and criminal acts. That most urban female gang members are drawn from low-income areas. And that lower-class adolescent females show greater unsatisfactory school experiences, that they lack educational goals beyond high school, that they have higher rates of physical and sexual abuse, which I think I've beat to death in this chapter already. They're more likely to become pregnant and have to deal with motherhood at young ages. They have higher rates of drug and alcohol dependency, and they lack a supportive home network. So these are all ways that it appears coming from a lower income area or growing up in poverty as a female adolescent can lead, and these different problems that they have to deal with can lead to delinquency. So how do we prevent delinquency, or how do girls desist from delinquency? Well, we have this program called Girls Inc., which looks at various programs to offer juvenile female offenders. So in the Preventing Adolescent Pregnancy, they'll educate girls about the issues of sex and pregnancy. We have the Operation Start, which will hopefully is going to increase girls' interest in math, science, and the technology fields. They'll teach them things about violence and how to prevent becoming a victim of violence or becoming violent themselves. Teaching them to think critically about how women are being portrayed in the media and how these young girls can grow up and change that narrative. Teaching them how to handle money, and even giving them scholarship opportunities. So in the way that females desist from crime, it's thought that they undergo a cognitive transformation. So first, the offender has to be open to change. They then need to be exposed to hooks or a set of hooks that actually enables them to change their behavior, such as these programs. They then need to envision a different self. So they need to see that they can be different than their delinquent self. So they transform by viewing that former deviant lifestyle in a new way. So they're now viewing that deviant lifestyle as one that they don't want to identify with. So female gang members specifically typically leave the gang because they have a child, they get married, they're dealing with parenting those children, or they obtain employment, which shows that this is the transformation process that a female gang member would go through. So first they have to be open to the change, and then they have to be exposed to a way to make that change. And then they envision their different self. So a female gang member who now has a child and is married and has a job no longer identifies with that gang or that lifestyle. And then a longitudinal study by Rebecca Katz actually showed that childhood victimization, sexual discrimination, adult racial discrimination, and domestic violence can largely explain why women become involved in crime. So in sum, there's been a recent focus on biopsychological vulnerability factors specifically related to female offending. From a psychological viewpoint, we look at psychiatric disorders and female delinquency. Sociological factors are also considered and can explain much of the gender gap that exists in delinquency. Gender gap meaning the differences in offending and delinquency between males and females. The feminist theory argues that a relationship between a girl's victimization experience, that there is a link and a relationship between girls' victimization experiences and them engaging in delinquency. That while males are more likely to become involved in delinquency, females actually use alcohol and marijuana at the same rates as do males. That data does not support that females are becoming more violent. Instead, it's those other various reasons, the system's response to those female offenders. That females have been treated differently by the system, and that those involved, as a result of society's disapproval of sexual activity and a need to protect these young girls. And finally, coming from a lower social class has been linked to greater involvement in delinquency. So that was your Chapter 4 lecture on the differences in genders and delinquency and offending. There will be a PDF posted as well so you can follow along.